Hello and welcome to First Contact, the world's first podcast where we openly discuss all things relating to humanity's preparation for open contact with extraterrestrial intelligence. I'm your host, Isha Patel. If you are loving this content, please be sure to join us in the First Contact Facebook community and let us know what you think. Let's dive into another exciting episode of First Contact. Hello and welcome to today's episode of First Contact. I'm your host, Ish Patel, and today I'm so excited to introduce you to Kevin Randle. Kevin Randle has served in the Army in both the Iraq War and the Vietnam War. He has spent over 50 years investigating the topic of UFOs, and he really knows his stuff when it comes to what's what. So Kevin, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're so excited to have a chat. I know you've authored over 80 books and you have a lot of experience. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about yourself as we dive into the topic of everything that you know about UFOs.
I've been doing UFO research for more than 50 years. I've talked to practically everybody who is anybody in the field, starting with people like Don Kehoe, the Lorenzens from APRO. I've written 37 books on UFOs. Brad Steiger, a good friend of mine, the late Brad Steiger, he and I argued who'd written the most books about UFOs. He said it was me, and I said it was him. I think I've now won, but Nick Redfern's making a run at the record. I served in the United States military as both a helicopter pilot, an aircraft commander, and later as a intelligence officer, and retired as a lieutenant colonel. I've been to both online universities and, of course, bricks and mortar universities, and have, of course, an undergraduate degree, 2 master's degrees, and a PhD in psychology. From that point, I've just continued my research and tried to share as much of that information with the public as I can. On my blog, for example, I think I've written over 1,300 entries on the blog about UFOs and that sort of thing. And that can be accessed for free on the World Wide Web, of course. And then, of course, the books that are available at Amazon. And that's, I think the latest is, I think the latest, I think, is Understanding Roswell, although I've done one called the Best of Project Bluebook, which deals with what I think of some of the better cases in Project Bluebook, bringing today's information to bear on the investigations that they did back in the 60s and 70s. And I will say this, interestingly, and I was thinking about this the other day as we were getting ready for this, the Australian Air Force had gotten a hold of one of Don Kehoe's books, and I'm not sure which one it was, and they were impressed with the information he had in that book about the UFOs, about flying saucers. So they contacted the United States Air Force. And the United States Air Force, of course, said, well, there's nothing to it. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He doesn't have any inside information. And it kind of put the damper on the Australian investigation. Well, it turns out, now that we have the documentation and all the files, it turns out that Kehoe was right more often than he was not. And the United States Air Force misled the Royal Australian Air Force on the subject of UFOs, which I thought was kind of interesting given what we're doing here today.
Right. Well, I think, I do want to get into the cover-ups in just a moment, because I think there has been a lot that's been shoved under the rug in the US, in Australia, across the board. First obvious question, do you believe that there is intelligent life out there?
I think almost anybody who has thought about it with any degree of rationality understands that there's probably life on other planets. I mean, the galaxy is 110,000 light years across and holds 4 or 5 billion stars, and many of the stars have planets. I think the latest count is we've discovered 5,000, more than 5,000 exoplanets, some of them in what's called the Goldilocks zones, which is where water can exist on the planet's surface as water, not as ice or something else, which is what we believe is one of the building blocks of life. So to suggest there is no other life in the galaxy or the universe is probably a ridiculous proposition. The question becomes, can they get here from there? And that becomes very problematic, at least understanding physics as we do today. with all the ancillary problems we have not been able to solve. Traveling through interstellar space, we cannot exceed the speed of light, which means the closest planets are 4 or 5 light years away, and traveling at the speed of light, you've got to accelerate to it and slow down. So it takes more than 4 years to get there and back. That sort of thing. So I understand all of that. So the question really boils down to is, can they get here from there? And I believe, based on the information I have seen, and this includes looking through the Project Bluebook files and discussing it with colleagues who have all sorts of understanding of this sort of thing, including I spoke to James Van Allen, the radiation belts guy, about UFOs at one point. And so I've looked at it from all these points of view, and I think that the preponderance of evidence suggests we are being visited. Yes. That was a long-winded way to get there.
It's a big claim. Have you personally seen any of these craft, had any experiences yourself that you can speak about?
I used to say no, I hadn't seen a UFO, because the one sighting I had was really crummy. I used to belong to the Denver UFO Society when I was a teenager going to high school. And a friend of mine joined the Denver, Colorado UFO Society, and we had a meeting in Castle Rock, Colorado. And we were sitting around the campfire watching the sky, and a light crossed the sky from north to south. It got directly overhead and it flashed once, and somebody said, "Oh, look, they're signaling us." And it continued on. Well, my friend and I, what we did was we looked to see if there were any satellites in polar orbits at the time that we would have been able to see, and the answer was no. So we saw something cross the sky. It would look like this International Space Station today, but it was in a polar orbit, and that's it. It's a light in the sky, basically. A nocturnal light, I think, is what Jell and Hynek would have called it. There's no ship, nothing like that, just this light moving across the sky, and it would have been at several 100,000 feet. So that's my UFO experience.
Okay, that's something. I love that. But you've spoken to a lot of people who have had significant experiences, abductions, like all sorts of things, right?
Yes.
Now, do you believe that the US government or the Australian government is holding on to some craft that may be from off-world?
Well, I don't think the Australian government has any of that. I think the Australian government was misled by the US government on what was going on. I spoke earlier about the Australian Air Force wanting to verify some of the stuff in Don Kehoe's books and begin their investigation of UFOs. And the US Air Force said, well, there's nothing to it. You can just ignore that. So we have to look at that the US government kind of guided our allies, our compatriots in the world, in the wrong direction. I think, based on the evidence I've seen, that the US government probably does possess an alien spacecraft, and this would be the one that fell at Roswell in 1947. And I've talked to any number of senior officers who were there in 1947, including the provost marshal. He's like the chief of police, the head of security for the base, had told me that he couldn't talk about it. I would ask him, I'd ask him questions. Well, I can't tell you that. I was sworn to secrecy. I can't talk about it. As he was in the hospital with terminal cancer, his children asked him about it. And he gave them some information to suggest, yes, it was an alien spacecraft. He said to the granddaughter, "Oh, the creatures." And I think he gave more information to some of the his older children about that as well. I talked to Bill Brazel, of course. He was the son of the man who found it, and Bill Brazel told me about what he had picked up on the ranch there near Corona, New Mexico, and what he described as things that we really don't have today, which was this metal with a memory. We talk about this foil-like material that you could wad up and drop on the table and it would unfold itself without a sign of a crease. We have nothing like that today. He mentioned what he called monofilament fishing line, and he said, well, you could shine a light in one end and it would come out the other. And he was, of course, talking about fiber optics, which we do have. And he talked about some very lightweight not very dense materials. It was just extremely strong. So, we look at that sort of thing, and we look at the preponderance of evidence. What happens is we get lost in all the nonsense that's spun about this, all these people coming forward and saying, well, yes, I was there and I saw this and I saw that. We get lost in all of that stuff. And I know Don Schmidt and Tom Carey and I have worked tirelessly to vet the people and make sure their stories are consistent. They're telling us the truth. And we've outed any number of people who were less than candid in their descriptions. So I think the answer to the question is yes, the US government recovered something. And I think, yes, it is what created the need for the cover-up. That was the reason they hid the information, because if we could figure out how these things worked, we move far ahead of our competitors in the world, because we've got the inside track. If we can reverse engineer this thing, I think the technology was so far superior. We haven't figured it out yet, but we still have it, and we still would be working on it. That's my opinion based on what I've seen and who I've talked to. And I outlined it in any number of books about the Roswell case, the latest one being Understanding Roswell. I did one a number of years ago called Roswell in the 21st Century, which people thought was a discourse to belittle the Roswell case. And all I was trying to do was say, this is what we know today based on where the research has taken us today, as opposed to what we thought we knew in the 1990s, and how the information has evolved into something more important and more credible, eliminating some of the testimony. What I said at the time was, the case isn't as robust as it once was, because some of the people we believed is telling the truth, we found out were not telling the truth. And that hurt the overall picture. So, you look at all of that sort of thing, and then you take a look at the Project Bluebook files, which were written in a time when I don't think the officers involved thought there was a prayer that the information in those files would become public knowledge. And now they're online, for crying out loud. And as we go through the documentation, we can see how things were manipulated. Looking at the Levelland case, this was a case in November of 1957 in Levelland, Texas, which if you're in Australia and you look at a map, you need to look at Lubbock, because Levelland is right near Lubbock, and I'm sure Levelland won't appear on the map, but Lubbock probably will. And then Panhandle, the Texas area, where the craft was seen close to the ground. It stalled car engines. The sheriff said at one point that he had received hundreds of phone calls about this object stalling cars. The Air Force said, well, we investigated and only 3 people saw a craft, and we don't think there's anything to it. In my research, going through all of that information, I discovered that there were Air Force officers involved with the sheriff on the night of the sightings. When they went out looking for the object, they actually saw something. The documentation suggests the sheriff described it as football shaped, which is not soccer, it's football, an oval-shaped object in the distance. And the next day he had his car serviced to see if there was something wrong with it. But the only reason he would have done it is his car stalled. And what we found out, or what I found out, was that the sheriff's car was followed by a car with the state police in it. That would be the Texas Department of Public Safety, sort of the highway patrol guys and things like that. And following them was a car from Reese Air Force Base filled with Air Force officers. So if the sheriff got close enough to see the object and his car stalled, so did the Air Force officers. And I've been unable to find any leads into who those officers were. But I found documentation suggesting the Air Force was involved. But there's nothing in the Bluebook files, and there's nothing that I can find to talk about that. But those guys were interviewed at some point, probably at length. So that right there suggests the cover-up.
Right. If you could just summarize in Project Bluebook, what were some of the key pieces of evidence that you felt suggested that this craft does actually exist?
In the Project Bluebook files, which goes from Project Sign starting officially in January of 1948, but the unofficial investigation began literally in December of 1946 before Kenneth Arnold made the sighting in June of 1947. There is nothing in the Project Bluebook files about Roswell. There are all kinds of other cases where they're talked about crashed UFOs and hoaxes and things like that in that time period. But the only thing I could find, there was a 4-paragraph news clipping in one of the files that said the officers at Roswell were issued a blistering rebuke for talking about having a flying saucer, having captured a flying saucer. That's the only reference to Roswell that I was able to find in the Project Bluebook files. When we look at other things in the files, there are some very interesting cases. And I mentioned the Levelland case, for example, the Washington Nationals, and this is named for Washington, D.C.'s National Airport, which I think is now the Ronald Reagan National Airport. And UFOs, flying saucers, were seen on radar on 2 consecutive Saturday nights in July of 1952. They were intercepted by jet fighters at times. Airline pilots were called and asked to see if there was an object out there where these were displayed. On the second night, there were 2 guys in the radar room from the military, Dewey Fournay, a major who was the Pentagon liaison to Project Bluebook on UFOs, and Al Chop, who was the Pentagon UFO spokesman. They were in the radar room that night. I talked to both those guys a number of years ago. And one of them told me that one of the sightings got pretty gory, pretty hairy. And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I can't talk about it." So when I called the other one, and I forget which one I called first, when I called the other one, I says, "Al Chop was talking about this gory sighting you had." He said, "Oh, yeah." And he told me the whole thing because he figured I already knew what it was. But you've got that sort of thing. The Air Force then held a press conference, and they determined it was a temperature inversion was causing this. The radar operator said no. The returns were on 4 separate radars, I believe, in the Washington, D.C. area. The interceptor radars picked up the objects. So temperature inversion is pretty well eliminated from the point of view. Both Dewey Fournay and Al Chop thought it was something anomalous. They didn't know what it was. It could be alien spacecraft. I don't think either one ever came out and really said, this was spacecraft. But what happened is in January of 1953, the CIA sponsored a panel. It's called the Robertson Panel. And they looked at all the evidence collected by Project Bluebook up to that point, from basically 1948 to the end of 1952. And they determined that there was nothing to it. There was no evidence of alien visitation. There was nothing of value to be determined or learned by further investigation. The whole thing should be shut down. They had access to all the information. And what's interesting is the leader of the Robertson panel, H.P. Robertson, high-ranking scientist, apparently went home that Friday night when the committee ceased its function, batted out a report, and the next morning had it all typed up and ready to go, and the members signed it, which suggests to me and others, such as Mike Swords, that the report was written before the panel ever met. And it was just a show, and what they determined was nothing to it, and we should debunk the whole thing, which I think is where the term debunkers really gets into the UFO lexicon. Here's a sighting that's very mysterious, and then we solve it. We show how it's solved. But from that point on, they weren't looking to solve sightings. They weren't really looking to investigate. What they were looking to do was create a public relations operation, which would suggest there's nothing to it. And it was very effective at the time because journalists would say, they were too sophisticated to believe in flying saucers, for crying out loud. So they would make fun of the stories, no matter what the story was and how much evidence was. The Air Force, and I mentioned Levelland, and here is Don Kehoe and the Air Force got into an argument. The Air Force said there was only 3 people that saw the object. Kehoe said there were 9. Going through the Project Bluebook files, I found the names of 13 who saw the object. So both those guys were wrong. The Air Force trying to belittle it. And then we discovered by talking to the sheriff and talking to other people in the area, there were literally dozens of sightings of this object on that night. But the Air Force, when they investigated, they spent 7 hours, I think, in Levelland, Texas. And the guy was gone for 3 or 4 of those hours, probably having a late lunch. And then he went back to his base near in Colorado Springs. So, I mean, the idea that Project Bluebook conducted a legitimate investigation is completely out of touch with the reality of the situation, even though in 1969, the Condon Committee, and that was the University of Colorado study of UFOs commissioned by the Air Force, said there was nothing to UFOs, nothing could be learned by further investigation. The Air Force had done a good job and they should close the Project Bluebook, which is what happened. We go back to the documentation, and this is where I said, I think there's things that were in the Project Bluebook files that nobody thought we would see at the time. There's a letter from an Air Force officer named Hitler, and this is the information's on my blog. So you type in like Hitler's name, and it'll take you to the point where you can read his letter. But he wrote to one of the people at the content committee, the University of Colorado study, and said, here's what we would like you to find. The Air Force did a good job. There's no need to continue the investigation, and there's nothing to it. And lo and behold, 18 months later, that's exactly what the Air Force found. So we can see where the whole thing was a put-up job and a waste of time. And of course, it worked for a while because scientists would say, well, there was a scientific study and nothing came from it, and there was no good evidence. And now we can look at what happened. One of my favorite cases in the University of Colorado studies, they said, here is a sighting that it was a natural phenomenon so rare it had never been seen before or since. I'm thinking from a scientific point of view, if you've discovered a new natural phenomenon, maybe it would deserve some additional study. It was a case from 1956, by the way. So the evidence of the cover-up is real. I think part of it is based on the incompetence of some of the officers appointed to lead the investigation. Some of them were rabidly anti-saucer, which means they never saw a case they liked. Some of them were more or less neutral on it. I think Ed Ruppelt was fairly neutral in this. And I think Robert Friend, who also was one of the chiefs of Project Bluebook, who, by the way, was a Tuskegee Airman. I don't know if that would mean anything to the Australian audience, but this was a group of airmen that during the Second World War, all African Americans who were trained as fighter pilots and were actually deployed into combat at the later stages of the war, and did a fine job as fighter pilots. But he was a Tuskegee Airman and gained a great deal of fame later on when it came out that he had been a Tuskegee Airman. But and he was fairly neutral, but you get into the later stages and they were just rabidly anti-saucer, and you can see it. There's a report from 1969 where a major is assigned to investigate a case, and you can read in his reports, he just absolutely hated it. It was a waste of his time. He couldn't believe the people were seeing these things, and just did a really crummy job of the investigation. But they were happy with that because it was investigated and that sort of thing. So yeah, it's clear there was a cover-up, and it was clear there was a great deal of incompetence involved.
So if these craft have been visiting since the last 75 years, I mean, there are a lot of people out there who claim to have had visitations or have been abducted, or, people I mean, this crosses over into like the psychic realm as well, where people are like, well, I've had telepathic contact and things like that. What's your opinion on that?
I stay away from the paranormal aspects of it because there are areas of that I don't understand, and I don't want to say, well, this is a lot of nonsense, because I've seen how that works in the entire UFO field. I have been in contact with Calvin Parker from the Pascagoula abduction in 1973. And interviewing him about that, and he said, well, there were other witnesses to the abduction, not just him and his friend, Charles Hickson. There were people on the ground who witnessed this, and he was telling me about some of those people that had come forward recently, and by recently, I mean in the last 2 or 3 years. And I said, well, why didn't they come out sooner? And going through the documentation, I shouldn't say I discovered, but they published a letter that was dated like the day after the abduction. And there's names of 2 people in there who had seen the craft, other than Hickson and Parker. I'm saying, well, here's an abduction case. And if you leave it in the hands of the 2 guys, you can say, well, they had some kind of hallucination or something like that. But now you're dragging in other people. And even though some of them kept their stories to themselves for 30, 40 years, we can now look at the documentation. It says, well, here are people who are talking about it within the next day. Ralph Blum did a book, man's contact with flying saucers or something like that came out in 1974, I think it was. And in his book, he's talking about people he'd interviewed within months of the sighting who had seen the craft as well. The skeptics, like Philip Klass, say, well, it was right near a well-traveled highway. How come nobody on the highway saw it, traveling across this bridge? They should have been able to see it. And one of the things I try to make clear in my investigations, it's always helpful to go to the scene, because you see things there that you don't really get on a map or photographs and things like that. And it turns out that the placement of the bridge, the placement of the vegetation, the placement of the pier where they were fishing, you have literally seconds to see anything, and and given the shape of the bridge, in one direction you can virtually see nothing, and the other one you have seconds, and you have to kind of look back over your shoulder to see down in there. So it's no surprise that people on the bridge didn't see anything. But there are other people who had come forward, and Blum talked to some of them, and there was additional people that Philip Mantle and Irene Scott found, who had kept their stories to themselves for decades, and only recently have come forward to talk about what they had seen. So we have an abduction case that isn't based solely on the experiences of the abductee. You have a case where others outside of the abduction saw the craft, saw things going on in that area that night, and there's documentation to show that they were talking to the sheriff's department and the Air Force the very next day. Mm-hmm. So it's a very, very complicated case. And if I was to point at a UFO abduction case that is incredible, that's the one I would point to. There are others that are interesting, but they don't have the same sort of independent corroboration that this case has. And that makes it a much more important case.
There's actually a lot of credible evidence. I mean, I think if you go further into the research, there's a lot of evidence, which begs the question, well, why aren't more people talking about it? Why the need for the cover-up, which I think you've covered already, because it seems to be that, I've sort of landed on the same theory as well, where I feel like, if the US government found a craft and had the intention of reverse engineering it in order to build better military weaponry and whatever else, then obviously they wouldn't want their other, surrounding countries to find out about it. For example, China, Russia, they'd want to try and hide it from them, right? So it makes sense why they haven't told. But I think, 75 years on, I think what we're seeing now is there is a slow process of disclosure that is happening. And, recent legislation, for example, now Biden has come out and said anyone who's had experience, he wants to hear about it. He wants to know about it. And so, do you feel like things are changing, or do you think the government's still pretty set on covering this up?
I did a book, UFOs in the Deep State. And the question that always posed to me was, why did they continue to cover it up? I mean, here we are, a very sophisticated society now. We've dealt with the idea of space travel for 75 years. And if you come out tomorrow and said, well, yes, there's alien visitation, it's really not going to affect anybody's life one way or another. I think what the problem is, and I think, well, to address your question, I probably should do that first, is I don't think we're moving toward disclosure. I think that it's the same thing we've seen in the past. I call what's going on now Twining 2.0. General Twining was the head of the Air Material Command in the United States, Army at the time, and then the Air Force, who began the investigation, who ordered the investigation of UFOs with Project Sign, which evolved into Project Bluebook. What we have now is the same sort of thing, but they were able to manipulate the situation so that we get nothing in the way of disclosure. We got the cockpit videos in 2017, and here we are 6 years later, and we really know nothing more about that. The Congress has passed legislation, and nothing was really done. We got a report that was 14 pages long, and I always called it a C- high school report because it told us absolutely nothing. They missed deadlines. I think when the legislation was passed, the idea was, well, nothing's going to happen and we're not going to do anything. And suddenly the news media, as the date for the disclosure came about, the news media started asking questions, they had to come up with something, and they came up with this very poor report. And I watched the entire hearing that was done, was it May of last year, with some of the congressional representatives quizzing two guys about what was being done. And one of them asked about the Maelstrom Air Force Base, where the missiles were taken offline by an outside influence, which is a matter of national security. And there was UFO sightings at the time as well. It's the Belt Montana thing. And once again, in my blog, if you go to Belt Montana, you can read more about that to get the details of it. The point is, when he asked about it, they both said, well, I don't know anything about that. I haven't heard about that. And then one of them later admitted, well, I've heard something about it. But the point is, we had the congressional hearing. It lasted, I think, 89 minutes, and there really was nothing there. They showed a video, which was virtually impossible to see. And here we are, we're still discussing this thing, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, but nothing's coming out. We're not seeing anything. We hear rumors about classified briefings and that sort of thing, but it's just the same thing that we saw in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. We don't do this sort of thing. We don't do that. I think the reason we still are having this problem is all about the power structure. And if I am in Congress or at the upper levels of the government, not in Congress, not the elected officials, but the bureaucrats that go from administration to administration to administration, I think if you take a look at all of that sort of thing, these people realize that their power evolves out of their knowledge, and they're not going to share with us things that are going to limit their power and their financial rewards. And I think that's one of the reasons that this cover-up has persisted. It's not because people would be frightened or anything like that. It's to maintain the power structure. And you take a look at it, every time a new administration comes in, they appoint a new Secretary of Defense and a new Secretary of State and new secretaries at these levels. But the people under those appointees, they're the power there. They're there for 30 and 40 years, and they're not going to do anything that's going to hurt their credibility or hurt their retaining their power. And I think that's why we don't hear anything more. But we're not really moving any closer. When the videos was released, I did a couple of blog entries where I thought, we're moving toward disclosure, and this is a good thing. And I mean, here we are 6-7 years later, and we know nothing more than we did when the videos were released. And it may be a ploy. I know one of the videos, they say, well, it was a glitch in the electronics. There was a guy on YouTube who wired his cell phone to night vision goggles and took a video of the night sky, and he got a pyramid-shaped object like one of the videos that the Navy released. And so it suggested some kind of an glitch in the electronics that created some of these things. And I think that's what they're going to do. So, well, we've looked at this, and here's where we are. It's some kind of a problem mirroring all the electronic components together. So I don't think we're going to move toward disclosure at all. I think we're just being led down the primrose path, and they're hoping that it'll all go away. One of the things they've done is we don't talk about UFOs anymore. They're UAPs. Well, why would you do that? Well, UFOs has a pejorative definition. No, it really doesn't. We all understand it. UFO is an unidentified flying object, and if you want to talk about a spacecraft specifically, you can say flying saucer. I think Stan Friedman, Don Schmidt, and I decided when we want to talk about spacecraft, we say flying saucer as opposed to UFOs, but they're divorcing the UFO field from the UAP field, and you're going to minimize what's going on with the UFOs because you're not really going to look into that stuff. And the UAPs is now something new and different. It's a way of disconnecting the history of ufology from what they're doing now.
Yeah, I have noticed that they keep changing the name as a way to kind of put it in a different bucket, or kind of split the research up into different areas. So you've done a lot of research into, the deep state, the military. You've spoken to a lot of whistleblowers. Where do we go to find the truth? I mean, where all the research that you've done, where does the truth actually lie? I'm sure there's a mid-ground somewhere where the average person can go and say, okay, like maybe there's truth to this, or maybe there's something going on. Where do you think the truth actually lies?
Well, in the original sources, I do something I call chasing footnotes. And I'll be reading a book and a guy will say, this happened and I got it from this source. Well, I go to that source to see what it says. And oftentimes that source says, well, I got it from a different source and a different source and a different source. So I try to trace it down to the original information. And oftentimes I find out that the original source isn't quite the same as what we're being told today. In fact, I've just done something about a story that came out supposedly in 1992, and it's actually been referenced in a couple of books about UFOs and was read into the congressional record, and it turns out the story's a hoax. It was invented by the Weekly World News, which was, I don't really want to say a tabloid newspaper. It was like the National Enquirer, but the National Enquirer at least had some credibility. They just made stuff up. I had a friend who worked there, and I don't remember, he said 2 weeks or a month, and he was doing a story on the Weekly World News on how they operated, and they were making stuff up all the time. And so this story came out of there, and you read the book, and they said, well, it came out in these Sri Lankan newspapers. Well, we can't find those newspapers. We can't find the story there. It comes from the Weekly World News. And so that's one way of separating the wheat from the chaff, if you will, by getting to the original sources. And sometimes it's difficult to do that. Although in today's world, it's much easier than it used to be. With your access to the World Wide Web, you can find practically anything on there that you want to, but you have to look at the original sources and look what the people said. One of the things that bothers me is there's a video on YouTube, and I've tried to get it taken down, of Glenn Dennis talking about what he saw in Roswell, calling about the bodies, the bodies and the caskets they needed for these little creatures. And the problem with the story is, I know Glenn Dennis is lying, or was lying about this, because we were able to chase down a lot of the different leads. But what bothers me about this video on YouTube is it came from the Air Force. And when the Air Force investigated the Roswell case back in 1995, a lot of the material they used was given to them by the Center for UFO Studies, by the Fund for UFO Research, and various researchers. I got a call from them a number of times about information, and the Glenn Dennis tape was supplied to them. Well, they were supposed to send the tapes back to the organizations that lent them, but they didn't do it. They boxed it all up and sent it to the National Archives. So the National Archives puts it on YouTube, and now it looks like it's a credible story, because here's Glenn Dennis interviewed by the Air Force during their investigation about his experiences in Roswell. Well, it wasn't Glenn Dennis being interviewed by the Air Force. It was Glenn Dennis being interviewed by Don Schmidt, a guy named Wolf, forget his first name now, Wolf, and me. And the first voice you hear on the tape is mine. And so people look at that and they say, well, here's this tape that came from the Air Force as part of their investigation. And boy, isn't this credible? No, it's not. And so you have to take a look at all of that stuff. There's plenty of information out about Glenn Dennis and the lies he told. And I've covered it in both Roswell in the 21st Century and Understanding Roswell, about how that story mutated. But that's the kind of thing you have to do. And most people don't have the time or the inclination to trace these things down, because sometimes it takes literally weeks of phone calls and letters and emails and going to archives sometimes to look at the original materials to see what they have to say and how they report this stuff. So that's what you have to do. And when I do that, I try to put it in either the books or I put it up on my blog. Say, here's the original sources. Here where I got the information. Here's how you can find those sources yourself, and you can check out to see if my interpretation is accurate. But that's the thing you have to do. And there's so much nonsense out there. People making things up. One guy was talking about how he was abducted when he was 17 years old, taken and trained, and he fought a war on Mars with alien allies against other alien races. And it took 20 years. He was there for 20 years. And then he was discharged from this organization that drafted him, abducted him, and he was sent back in time, and he woke up in his bed 15 minutes after the abduction took place. Well, the story's utter nonsense. And it hurts the UFO field, it hurts the abduction phenomenon, it hurts all kinds of things. And yet this guy was invited to the MUFON conference several years ago to talk about his experiences, not because he was credible, but because there were a lot of people who would come and want to listen to his story. And so you have to take a look at that stuff, and it
The
sometimes
motivation
stretches.
then
Pardon
to
me?
make, what would be the motivation for them to make this stuff up? Like Glenn Dennis, like what does he have to gain by making up stories? Or this, this Mars one has come up quite a few times. I think people like Corey Good and David Wilcox talk about that stuff, which
Yes.
I don't know where, I don't know where any of that sits. I don't go into that stuff a lot, but that sounds very similar to some of their sort of stuff that they put out.
Well, I think that part of it's the draw of the spotlight. If I tell an incredible story, well, I'll get on the news. I'll get on TV. I'll be invited to conferences, and they'll pay my way, and they'll give me an honorarium for speaking there, and I can sell my books, that sort of thing. And I think it's a very powerful draw. I know. I hesitate to say any names of living people. Robert Willingham. I did a book called A History of UFO Crashes back in the mid-1990s. And I had the story of Robert Willingham, who claimed as a fighter pilot, he had seen a UFO crash on the border between Texas and Mexico back in, originally, I think he said 1947, then it became 1950. And as I was putting together a history of UFO crashes, I got a hold of the affidavit that he had signed. And I discovered that later on, after the book came out, I did another one called Crash When UFOs Fall from the Sky. And I think, well, I got to see what's going on with this Willingham guy. And I looked him up on the internet and found out the rest of the story, if you will. But it turns out that originally the story was from 1947. He was flying an F-94 fighter. The F-94 fighter, of course, didn't become operational until the 1950s, so he couldn't have been in an F-94. He claimed to have been a colonel in the Air Force, retired in the Air Force, and he wasn't. He was a lieutenant colonel in the Civil Air Patrol. And I don't know if you have anything like that in Australia, but this is an auxiliary of the U.S. Air Force. It's made up of civilians. There's a cadet program, and I was actually in the cadet program at one point. And you wear a modified Air Force uniform, but you don't get paid. It's completely voluntary. And they perform a very important function in search and rescue. Rather than tying up Air Force resources at great amounts of money, the Civil Air Patrol does an awful lot of search and rescue in the United States, for small aircraft that disappear and things like that. Very important. And he was a lieutenant colonel of that, but he was never on active duty as a fighter pilot. He spent 13 months in the Army, but he was never in the Air Force. He didn't retire. He wasn't a lieutenant colonel. And so by looking on the internet and going back, I could find this out. But he was working with a guy originally named Todd Zeckel, who wanted to write a book about the crash because of the Roswell incident. And Willingham was looking for his 15 minutes of fame. He wanted to be one of those guys that somebody had been involved in this UFO crash story. And he kept changing the dates. He kept changing the information. And there were pictures of him in 1960, like an Air Force uniform. And people said, well, if he was making this stuff up today, why are there pictures from him in the 1960s in his Air Force uniform? I said, well, can you send me a picture? And they did. And I looked at it and I said, that's a Civil Air Patrol uniform. There's a metal plate that they wore over the right breast pocket. And it says Civil Air Patrol, auxiliary of the United States Air Force. He wasn't an Air Force officer. He was in the Civil Air Patrol. He tried to conflate that into being an Air Force officer. And he talked about being a fighter pilot. There's no evidence he went to military flight school. He claimed in Korea, he and a friend were stationed in Korea as lieutenants, and they would steal P-51 Mustangs and go off and fly missions on their own and bring them back. And I said, it just doesn't work that way, because as a helicopter pilot from Vietnam, I know how this stuff works, how the aviation assets are deployed. And if you fly into an area, you need to check in with the forward air controller. You cannot just start shooting up the ground willy-nilly, because you're not going to know where our forces are and the enemy forces are. And if you do not know the proper call signs, you're going to get shot out of the sky. So he was telling these stories, and he said he was injured in a mortar attack. And so he wasn't allowed to fly in the Air Force anymore. So he went into the Air Force Reserve. And I had a friend, I was in the Iowa National Guard at the end of my career, and we were working with a lot of Air Force fighter pilots. And so I asked him about this. I said, well, he couldn't fly because of the Air Force regulation on the ejection seats. He didn't have his injuries would have precluded that. So he went in the reserve, and they said, no, the ejection seats in the reserve airplanes are just like the ones in the active forces. He wouldn't be allowed to fly at all. So he didn't know those sorts of things. So, but that kind of gets you to why would he do that? Well, it gains him fame. There's a book that came out called Stolen Valor by a guy named Burkett, and it's about all these people that claim service in Vietnam who never served. Some of them were in Vietnam as clerks, but didn't get the medals that they claimed they earned. Some of them were in the army, but never served in Vietnam, and some of them never even served in the military. But they were getting the accolades by pretending to be Vietnam veterans. In today's environment, back in the 60s and 70s, when the Vietnam veterans were coming home, they, of course, were the bad guys. And in Hollywood, for example, they said, well, the quickest way to identify someone as evil is make him a Vietnam veteran. That, of course, is now all flipped on that. And I know Australia had an awful lot of soldiers who were in Vietnam as well. But I think that's the answer. Is it's the draw of the spotlight. We get some kind of fame or acknowledgement or recognition for that sort of thing. You can end up going to conferences, and people will surround you and talk to you. You can be invited to the conferences and all that sort of thing. And people doing documentaries will call you to get your story so they can talk about it. And oftentimes in the documentaries, they're just interested in the stories. They're not interested in the follow-up. And fairly, Don Schmidt and I got caught up in some of that when we were doing the first Roswell book. We were talking to these people, and they would tell us these stories, and I could not believe that people would be making this stuff up. And it turns out, yeah, they are. They're making this stuff up because it does something for them, whether it's ego or monetary or whatever. It just does something for them.
So, having done your due diligence, you've obviously spent a lot of time finding the source of this information. What would you say, other than the Hicks and Parker case, were some of the top credible cases that you would advise looking into?
Well, are you just looking at abductions or just general cases? Because if you're looking at general cases, Legoland is a very intriguing story. The Bentwaters, Rendlesham Forest landings of December of 1980 is a good story. I think the Westfall story from Australia is very good, very interesting. Although I understand they now explain it as a weather balloon. Isn't that surprising?
There was actually one Australian case, I believe, in Melbourne, where a school of children.
Yes, I think it's Westfall.
Is that one?
Yes.
Yeah. And they went and later interviewed all the adults on that specific case, and they got the adults to sit there and each draw their experiences of what they remembered as a child, and then they all had the same experience. We're talking like classrooms of children, not like a small amount. And there's teachers, like everyone who saw it.
There's a similar case from Africa, and I think it was Rhodesia, and it's now Zimbabwe. A case like that from Zimbabwe, which is similar. You've got the Legoland case with all of those witnesses. You've got the Washington Nationals. There's cases in Michigan where people were seeing a craft and generated the first of the congressional investigations in 1966. There's lots of good cases. The Socorro case from Lonnie Zamora, the police officer saw the landed craft out of Socorro, New Mexico in 1964 is a wonderful case. Which everybody would say, well, it's just single witness. And it turns out, no, it's not single witness. There's a bunch of people that saw the craft, and the investigation again was bungled on that. I did a book, which is called Encounter in the Desert, which looks at it in depth. So there's a lot of good cases out there. What's interesting is I do not find the same sort of robust cases in the world today that we've had in the past. And I don't know the reason for it. Carl Flock and
I mean, in Montana recently, there's been some activity. It's been all over the news. Some people are saying it's balloons. Some people are saying military was escorting it. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, my point is, it's not the same kind of robust cases that we used to get with literally dozens of witnesses and landing traces and radars and photographs. And my friend Carl Flock and I used to discuss this, and we thought, it's kind of like the aliens got here. They gathered all their information as quickly as they could over a period of weeks. They got back on their spacecraft and they've gone home to the university and are now sorting through it, kind of like an expedition to study the rainforests in South America, for example. We gather a lot of stuff there and then we go home and study it. And so we don't get the kind of robust cases. In 1973, when Hickson and Parker were abducted, we got an awful lot of abduction cases, but we got a lot of cases of the beings on the ground and seeming to be gathering the flora and the fauna and trying to grab animals and things like that they take back to their spacecraft. And it's I just saw a statistical analysis and showed a real spike in those kind of reports in September and October and November of 1973, and the Hickson Parker abduction took place in the middle of that. So there's a lot of good cases, and I've done a number of books where I examine a specific case like that in depth and bring all the ancillary information in that I can to suggest the credibility of the case.
Mm-hmm. So the recent, sightings that's been all over the news, I mean, do you believe it's real? Have you come across any evidence to suggest there's something substantial in that?
We don't get a lot of the data. There are the fighter pilots, for example, the Navy fighter pilots who are talking about what they have seen, but some of that is based on them seeing it not visually outside the cockpit. By looking at it, they're seeing it on the heads-up display, electronically reproduced for them, and that sort of thing. But they're not the same kind of robust sightings that we used to get when we had intercepts going on. Mm-hmm. And that's part of the problem. But we don't have all the information either, because we're now in that netherworld of the national security, because they can't reveal a whole lot about how the stuff was detected, because that gives our competitors in the world a clue on how our equipment works that could set it up for being jammed in the event of some kind of more hostile intent. So they have to be careful what they say, but we don't have the kind of access to the information. We've got the Project Bluebook files now, so I can go through that and I can see what they've done and I see what they were doing. Yeah, this case is explainable as a weather balloon. This case is explainable as Venus. This case has no explanation, even though they said this is what it was. So we can take a look at that, but I'm waiting to see what kind of information comes out. And so far, we haven't gotten a whole lot. All we've gotten recently, I think, is the Air Force, or the Arrow, which we call the new investigation Arrow, said they had like 500 reports, military reports. But what does that mean? What's a report? Is it one guy for every, or one sighting for every report, or is it like 12 guys in one sighting? So we've got 12 reports. So it's really not, it's not really 12 different cases. It's one case, but with 12 different witnesses. And so we don't have the kind of information we need to make any kind of analysis. I know that John Greenwald at the Black Vault gathers that information and provides as much as he can, but he's not getting a lot of help either. Through the FOIA requests and that sort of thing. So we have to take a look at all of that. But right now we're at the point where we just don't have the kind of information we need to determine whether or not there's something new going on in the world of flying saucers, UFOs, UAPs, or whatever the heck they are today. But we can look at the history and we can look at the things that are going on and we can look at what the civilians are saying. At one point, it seemed that the investigation they wanted to launch here was going to center on military witnesses. And I'm thinking, well, what about the civilian witness? An airline pilot who probably had training in the Air Force at one point as a jet fighter pilot or something. I mean, he's going to be a credible witness, but we're going to ignore that because he's employed by a civilian organization, rather a military organization. And so there's a lot of things we just don't know. And they said, well, we're going to go back just to 1995. Well, that's not going to help. You don't understand the history of this thing. And if you don't understand the history of this thing, you're going to make the same mistakes that have been made for for the last 75 years. And I think NASA now is talking about doing some kind of historical research. And I know that a couple of the people they called into interview, or maybe one of the investigations called in some people, and I'm a little leery of a couple of the witnesses they called because I just don't find their stories credible. But we've got all that problems, and they just don't seem to. They're reinventing the wheel, is what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. There were quite a lot of witnesses with the recent one as well. I actually spoke with someone from Montana earlier this week who was there when all of this activity was happening, and she said that there were some local photographers who took photographs, and like credible people who worked in newspapers and things like that. And one of the biggest I guess distinction points that I was told from this person I had a chat with, she said that there was a lot of EMF that was reported across the board, which typically wouldn't happen in a standard, if it was just a weather balloon, like you wouldn't have all that EMF, right? And so she was saying that there was a lot of EMF. There were like other sightings in addition to what the news portrayed. So it seems that there is a mystery worth pursuing in the recent few weeks, because there's been enough eyewitness sort of evidence to suggest that there's something there.
As long as we have a good sighting, we have witnesses we can talk to and evidence we can take a look at, then of course it's worth pursuing. If there's an explanation and we have a legitimate explanation, then we need to put that aside and move on. I did an investigation a number of years ago where the witness said that she had seen a dome disc with alien shadows in it, in the dome. And I went out and I talked to the guy that was with her at the time, and he said, well, no, it was just lights in the sky. And he said, we did it with the Palisades Kepler State Park in Iowa. And I drove there, and I was sitting there where they had seen the object, and I saw the airplanes landing at the commercial airport. And I realized what they had seen were the landing lights of the airplanes right. at night. And she had conflated it into this wonderful story of a dome disc with alien creatures. And he said, I don't know what she's talking about. And they had called the airport, and the airport said, well, we have no commercial landings going on. Yeah, but civil aviation uses the airport too, and they have landing lights as well. I watched the landing lights. It was exactly what they described. And so, here's a case that, well, there was two witnesses, and they talked to the police, and the woman was very frightened by the whole situation. I don't think the guy was much more solid than she was, but his observation seemed to be more accurate than hers. I don't want to say more credible, but more accurate. She truly believed what she was saying to me. I mean, it's not that she was consciously lying about it, but in her mind, I think what she had done was it was beneficial to her to see a craft and aliens or some kind of humanoid figure in it, rather than these lights in the sky that they couldn't explain. It was just her way of dealing with the whole situation. But the point is, you've got to take a look at it, and sometimes the information is just takes you to a solution, and you got to say, well, okay, that one's solved. Let's go on to the next one. So we've got to just gather the information as best we can when we get the sightings. MUFON still gathers UFO sightings and investigates them with their field investigators, and produces some very interesting cases in today's environment.
So even with all the hoaxes and the explainable phenomenon, do you still believe there's enough out there evidence-wise to suggest that actually there is still something more than what the government is telling us?
Absolutely. I mean, I've talked to the people, I've talked to the witness, and I see how the information has been manipulated by the news media and by the government and by the Air Force. I've seen how all that's done, and I talked to the people themselves to get an idea of what they had seen. And I understand that, people's memories mutate over time, and they massage the memories, or when you access a memory, it's slightly altered from what it was originally. And I understand all that. So the closer you can get to the actual sighting to gather the information, the better off you are. I understand all of that. But there is enough information out there in good, solid cases, and I've featured them in any number of books that I've done, where there's enough information to suggest that there is no solution, no terrestrial solution at this point. And that's what I say about the Roswell case, for example. We have eliminated all the terrestrial explanations that we can. Doesn't mean there isn't something else out there that we do not understand or do not have access to at the moment that would explain it in terrestrial terms. But we don't have that right now. Is that enough to move it to the extraterrestrial? For some people it is. For me, I say, yeah, we don't have a terrestrial explanation. The extraterrestrial makes the most sense with the information we have today, but that could be altered tomorrow.
Right. Just before we wrap up, I mean, look, there's a lot of people out there who have, claim that they've been abducted and have maybe like physical, tangible experiences, like people who are left with scars or like random, implants and stuff left inside them, or tattoos and things like that. What's your thoughts on that?
I think the vast majority of the abduction phenomena is explainable in terrestrial terms. And I've investigated a case in 1973, as a matter of fact, where a woman claimed that she and a number of her children had been abducted. Mm-hmm. And it looked very credible. I worked with Dr. Jim Harder. I didn't want to describe him as an expert hypnotist because I learned long afterwards he wasn't quite the expert we thought he was. Telling me things that like, well, people can't lie under hypnosis and it's a pathway to the truth and blah, blah, blah. But for the longest time, I believed her until I came across something known as sleep paralysis. Mm. And I am convinced she had an episode of sleep paralysis, and the episode was communicated to her children. And that was why their stories were never as robust as hers, of course. But, and not all of them were abducted either, according to what they said. But here's a case of I am absolutely convinced it's sleep paralysis. She believes she was abducted. And, Philip Clash, you say, well, give them a lie detector test. Well, if they truly believe they're abducted, the lie detector isn't going to do any good. Doesn't mean they were abducted. It means they truly believe it. It's a subtle difference there. So
well, I think some of the abduction experiences, like, the people who say they've been to Mars and things like that, there are some theories that suggest that maybe there were some like other types of experiments that were being done on people at the time, maybe through the use of drugs or, other sort of phenomena out there that then made them believe that they had these off-world experiences, but really they were just under some sort of other type of experiment that was going on.
If you take a look at the Bentwaters case from December of 1980 and the Air Force people involved in that, and that's discussed in UFOs in the Deep State, they were subjected to all kinds of interrogation, both hypnotic and chemical. And I think some of the memories they have were induced by that investigation. But there was a precipitating event. And when you talk about that, I think that John Burroughs, who got as close to the craft, to the object, whatever it was, as anybody, spent literally years fighting with the Air Force for disability because of injury sustained in his close approach to the UFO. I think he's the only person in the United States military, or from the United States military, who retired on 100% disability because he was involved with a UFO sighting. Mm-hmm. And so there you have something that's a little bit different there. And then here's a guy with the documentation to suggest his injuries were sustained because of his close approach to this UFO while on active duty. Mm-hmm. So, it's one of those things. You have to take a look at all of that sort of thing. And I think you're right. Some of it is induced by their own use of psychedelic drugs, or any sleep paralysis, I think, explains part of it. I think there's terrestrial explanations for a large number of the abductions, but there's always that one or two. And again, getting back to Hicks and Parker, there's always like something like that, well, you just don't have a terrestrial explanation for that. It's not sleep paralysis. They weren't drinking. There were other witnesses. I mean, now we've got a whole different story going on. So, you have to take a look at all that, but you also have to look at the entire picture. And I think part of the problem is there's all these other things going on as well. And I think part of it may have been manipulation by either unscrupulous researchers engaging in techniques they know nothing, they really shouldn't be using, or maybe government involvement in attempting to learn something about the human psyche.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a big topic. Kevin, thank you
Yes.
so much for joining us today. I feel like we could just keep going for hours and hours here.
Well, see, that's the problem. I could talk about UFOs for hours and hours. So you have to
Me too. But I think we will wrap it up there today. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with us. I can see that you've really put in the hard yards to do the research and the due diligence as well, which I think is so important because as you say, trying to sort the wheat from the chaff is like, I mean, that's half the ball game here. There's a lot of people out there saying a lot of things. And then especially when you get into the paranormal, the psychic space, there's, all sorts of experiences out there. And I think it's important to take a very pragmatic approach at times as well, to really look at where is the hard evidence, who's actually telling the truth. And I think, I'm also going to be following up some of the leads that you've mentioned as well, because it's great for me to sort of look into some of these things independently as well. So thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate you being here with us.
Well, I enjoyed my trip to Australia.
In the future.
Yeah. Well, I mean, today's trip to Australia was...
Yeah, exactly. You've gone into the future.
Well, that's yes, I forgot. Thank you for giving me the opportunity. So it's all good.
Yeah, no worries. Thanks for your time. Hey everyone, thanks for listening to First Contact. I'm your host Ish Patel, and I'm so excited to have this conversation about open contact with extraterrestrial beings. Come join me in the Facebook community where you can continue the discussion or keep listening for another episode of First Contact.